that God continues to clarify for us what his plan for our little church is here, and he's given us lots of good opportunities, and so I want to talk about some of that. But the beginning and the most important thing to establish up front, especially for those who are new here, is some of you who are fairly new, maybe you started coming this year, or you're a visitor and you're still getting to know us. But for those of you who are in that category, let's see if this, oh, great, it works. Awesome. You guys have no idea how much energy was expended trying to get this PowerPoint thing working earlier this morning. And it's actually working for basically one graphic. But thankful. So, because it's a great graphic. At least I think it's great. So let me back up and say this too before I get into the identity piece more. So some of you saw probably a month ago, maybe a couple months ago now, I sent around a survey and just asked you to give me some feedback. It was strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's called a SWOT survey. And we focused mainly on the leadership of the church, but I also sent it out to everybody, and I got feedback from a number of you. And that was helpful in kind of, you know how the phrase, you don't want to lose the forest for the trees. Well, sometimes in ministry life, you're so caught up in the details of everyday interaction with people and studying and all that you can kind of lose the big picture. So that survey helped me to kind of pull back a little bit, zoom out a little bit, get your take on things, how you're experiencing things, and that was great. And we had some good discussions in our leadership meetings related to the results of those surveys. And so one thing I want to say about that is I've always wanted, and I know Don has felt this way too, that the church would be a place where we all have some ownership. And what I mean by that is this is God's church and this is your church. And it's your church because it's God's church, meaning like God established this church to be a part of your life for your benefit, for your ability to grow in your understanding of who he is and what he's like and his faithfulness to you, and for you to have people around you who will help you in that regard, to help you to walk through life in a thoughtful way, and also to walk through life with other people who have common beliefs and who have a common understanding and love for the gospel. And so this is our opportunity to kind of look at everything afresh and consider, for starters, okay, what if we're going to define what really makes our church go? Like, what is it about us that we feel like is distinct, or what are we particularly excited about here? For some of you, this would be for review. Others of you, maybe not so much. But we've said over and over again that we've been freed in the gospel. So Galatians 5:1. If you're in Galatians again, I'm going to bounce around a little bit. But in the beginning of chapter 5, Paul says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." So he talks about the gospel in terms of freedom. And he's saying there's this temptation, there's this danger of becoming enslaved again. And he says, stand firm and don't succumb to the temptation. I think this is a great verse for kind of capturing what our church is about, is we are about celebrating the freedom of the gospel and staying focused on that, not losing sight of the simplicity of who Jesus is and what he's done for us. And I think the word freedom is perfect because it helps us realize that everything aside from the gospel, everything aside from Jesus in our lives is slavery. And if you were here last week, you heard me reference a book called His Needs, Her Needs. Some of you have heard of that book. It's one of the best sellers. If you go to Barnes & Noble and you look at the marriage books, it's one of the top sellers, okay? And I'm reading that because of a project I'm working on for school right now. And in one section of the book, he talks about our love banks. And he says, all of us have a love bank that's open all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have this love bank. And in this love bank, what's happening is we are evaluating other people and how we relate to them. And as we relate to them, if we have a good experience with them, if we have a pleasurable experience, it's like a deposit in the account. If we have an unpleasant experience with them, that's like a withdrawal from the account. And he says, in our relationships, whether that's romantic relationships, friends that we have, people we get together with in the church that we get to know, whatever, in those relationships, humanly, here's how it works. We're constantly keeping track. We're constantly keeping score. And as long as that person stays in the black with me, as long as there's more deposits than withdrawals, our relationship has a chance. But if that account becomes overdrawn, the relationship's going to suffer, and at some point, it might even be over. And oftentimes is over. And we've all experienced that, right? Well, he's saying, look, this is a human dynamic. It's very common. We all experience it. We know what that's like. And he doesn't go into this in the book, but I thought, wow, what a great opportunity to talk about the gospel, because when we look at the love bank in terms of how God views us, aside from Christ, which side of the ledger are we on? We're on the withdrawal side, aren't we? We could say, hey, try to be a nice person. We all have our own convictions and morals and things like that, and we're not as bad as we could be. And so we could say, well, hey, that sounds kind of extreme. I mean, is it really, I was just on the withdrawal side? Well, God says he's looking at your motives. He's looking at the core of your heart, and he sees everything clearly. And if you don't love him with everything, heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor is yourself, and he says everything that's an outworking, even if it looks good on the outside, anything that's an outworking of a heart that is not that in love with and enthralled with God and not putting the other person completely before oneself, he says that's a withdrawal. It's on that other side, the negative side of the ledger. When we talk about the freedom of the gospel and what the message of Galatians is look, because of Jesus, God has cleared that withdrawal side. He's taken care of that. He's cleared that out of your account. He's given you this infinite deposit, namely the righteousness of Jesus. And says now he relates to you on that basis. He's not keeping track anymore. There's no current activity in the withdrawal column on your account with God. If you stop and think about that, I mean, that is truly mind-blowing. Because even in your best relationships, even with your closest friends here in the church, even with the most gracious people you know, there's still some scorekeeping going on. And God says with him, there is not. There's no condemnation with him whatsoever. So when Galatians talks about freedom, it's saying, hey, that is the most liberated relationship you're ever going to enjoy, and that's the most liberating relationship you're ever going to enjoy. Don't leave it behind. And it is our plan, vision, mission, goal, call it whatever you want to call it, to continually put that message before you, to remind you that that is what your God is like, and that is what he has accomplished for you through Christ, which is different from every other sphere of life. If you were here last week, some of this will ring a bell, but I was talking about how in other parts of our lives, like in the business world, if you're working for some company, probably have an annual review of some kind, of performance review, where someone sits down with you and says, here's how you're doing, here's what's good, here's what's not so good. In the academic world, you're constantly taking tests and you're getting graded on papers. They're evaluating your performance and they're still deciding. The verdict isn't in quite yet whether or not you'll graduate and get that degree. They're still evaluating you in that sense. In relationships and romantic relationships, it's that way, isn't it? Even Santa Claus is judging you. And if you're not good enough, you'll get coal in your stocking. Remember that threat, right? Parents, we like to use that one. Get a little extra obedience out of our kids. You know, God is not like that. This is one sphere of your life in this relationship with God where you're not under that kind of pressure. That's what the Bible talks about in terms of freedom. You're loved by God with an everlasting love that will not change, that will not waver. So when we are stuck in sin and when we disobey and when we fail to love him and fail to love other people, which we all do, that's all more than taken care of, forgiven. And when God does, hear this now, when he does work in our lives and discipline us, just as a parent disciplines a child, he does it, as it says in Hebrews 12, for our good, that we might share in his holiness. He does it for our good. So we live in the sphere of grace and the sphere of freedom. And the message of Galatians is don't leave that behind. Don't try to add to Jesus. It's not Jesus plus your denomination, or Jesus plus your spiritual disciplines, or Jesus plus your favorite Christian author or favorite podcast. It's not Jesus plus anything that equals righteousness for you. It's Christ alone that equals righteousness for you. And Paul explains in Galatians, if there's something else in that area, something else after the plus sign, he says, beware of the temptation to try to find your status in something that you're doing or some commitment you have or some standard that you hold to. He says, Christ alone is your righteousness, and that alone is where your freedom is found and enjoyed throughout your life. So in terms of our identity, which is the little center circle there, That is who we are and what we are about, and we want to share in that together on an ongoing basis. And we believe that God is moving us with that identity, three distinct directions in terms of our mission. Okay, what's the outworking of that for our little church here? Three distinct directions. And if you have a really good memory, you might remember last year I used this graphic and we had all sorts of ways of describing it. I think someone called it an amoeba. I heard it looks like a turtle. I've heard lots of different things, but trying to illustrate the idea of organic life. Okay, as God breathes life into us through his gospel, he's done it once at one point in time, and he does it regularly, routinely, as we get together and talk about the gospel together. As that happens, there's life. And a big part of that for our church here is the upward extension. And here's what I mean by that. We are every week looking up together. That's why we come here to church. I've said to you before, but I think it's really important to point out, in our day and age, technology is a great blessing, right? All of you guys probably have your smartphone in your pocket right now. It might be buzzing at you as we speak, right? It's a gift. There's great things about technology. But as we, through technology, become more in tune with what's going on in the world, and we have instant access to videos and other forms of social media, don't you find that just your normal face-to-face interactions in some way or another are probably suffering at least a little bit as a result of that? A little bit? You have an opportunity. You, as I've said probably 100 times, you literally don't even have to get out of bed in the morning on Sunday. You can roll over, put on your phone, dial up your favorite pastor YouTube channel, and watch and roll back over and go to sleep afterwards. You don't even have to come here, right? But we believe there's something in getting together and worshiping together and the human dynamic of actually being alongside of other people in that process. And we believe that's how we learn of God's love most deeply, most profoundly, is in connection with other people. 1 John says it best when he says, look, can someone say, I know God and I walk in the light, if he hates his brother or has no fellowship with his brother? You'd be lying. And he says, how can you say you love God if you don't love the person you can see with your own eyes? There's some important connection. And from God's perspective, the vertical and the horizontal are like attached. They're linked. And so we get together week in, week out to celebrate the gospel as a group. We're going to have the Lord's Supper later. We call it communion, right? Together, sharing in the body and the blood of Jesus as a group. There's great freedom. There's great flexibility. We might have a whiteboard up here. We might have a PowerPoint. We might just have a Bible open and a talking head, whatever. It's going to be the same message. That will not flex. Flexibility in terms of how you hear it, but it's going to be that message, week in, week out. That's the message of life for us. God's gospel, who he is, what he's done for us through Christ. So there's the upward, okay? By the way, I should have said this earlier, but if you look at the narrative budget, these are the categories laid out in the narrative budget, and we've tried to correlate the funds that come in and are expended from the church. We've tried to correlate them with these categories, okay? So now the inward, let's see if I can get this thing to work again. So inward, and I just kind of given examples of the types of things that we're doing. Let me read another passage here in Galatians 5. So if you look at verse 13, chapter 5, verse 13 and 14, Paul says, for you are called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In light of what I said earlier about God's view of you and how secure you are in your relationship with him because of this unconditional love he has for you due to what Christ has accomplished on your behalf, it begs the question, well, what do we do with that freedom? I mean, we literally could go and do anything then and God would still love us. If you're in Christ, yes, that is absolutely true. As I said, you don't even have to roll over and get out of bed on a Sunday morning. You don't have to lift a finger. And yet, Paul urges us. He says, you're called to freedom, but don't use that freedom as an opportunity for the flesh that will only mean more destruction in your own heart and in the lives of the people around you. And you've already tasted the misery of that in your life. So he says, instead, through love, serve one another. And then he goes on to say, this is the fulfillment of the law. That's why I say, if you look on our website and even the narrative budget, I think I said God, through his gospel, is not bringing us under the domination or the enslavement of laws, but rather is liberating us to live in love, meaning to take our cues from how God has treated us and thus to treat other people. And that's what Paul is saying here. And he says that's the essence of the law. That's the whole point. And the gospel alone makes it possible for there to be fruit in those areas. So I want to illustrate that for you. Juliana had a basketball game last night. Didn't go so well. And I noticed after the game, even from hearing Juliana's feedback and some of the other girls, some of the things they were saying, there was frustration and there was a little division forming between different players on the team. That's pretty normal, right? And you guys have all experienced that. When things aren't going well, it's kind of easy to turn on each other. And again, that reminded me, well, that's just human nature. I mean, we want something, whether it's to win or we want the ball, we want to be in another position on the team, whatever. We want something, and even though we're trying to be a team and we're all wearing the same color jersey, if the other members of that team get in the way of what I want, then human nature is to try to find some way to get it, or to be angry if I don't get it, or to be resentful if I don't get it. Human dynamics. Very easily, we humans can turn on one another. Within the church, sad to say, it's the same story. Very easy for us to be fickle and to turn on one another. If there's any hope for there to be the opposite of that, it's going to be the gospel of God's relentless, unwavering commitment to us. And that dictates such that this can be an environment in terms of our fellowship with one another where there is relentless loyalty. Not ultimately because of us, but because of God. It comes from him, but it also is something we can enjoy. It's a gift of God to us through his Spirit. He has united us in Christ. That is our common faith. And so inwardly, the hope is that we will continue to enjoy that. And there's all sorts of things going on in terms of activities throughout the week and opportunities to get together for dinner and football games and fun things, and also Bible study and more serious things, all sorts of things going on. And the counseling culture meetings that we're doing at the Brewer House, lots of things going on that would relate to this aspect of our ministry of just together, delighting in the gospel and serving one another. And even as he says in Galatians 6:2, bearing one another's burdens and thereby fulfilling the law of Christ. So if we are under law, if we want to conceive of being under law in any way, it is the law of Christ. The law that does not involve any kind of condemnation, does not involve any kind of slavery, only involves opportunities to love and serve and to mutually enjoy that life of God being shared in together, which is pretty awesome. So outwardly, what's happening in terms of outward movement? Thankfully, God has given, despite the fact that we're a small church, lots of opportunities to network. I'm networking with other churches in the area. I'm teaching at Calvary Chapel's Bible College in the spring semester, their basics in biblical counseling class. I love doing that. I love taking theology and making it practical. I love taking the gospel and connecting it to real life. I get to do that in there, and through lots of other counseling opportunities I'm getting. I've mentioned often in preaching that I'm counseling people and I'm meeting with people on a regular basis, and many of them don't attend church here for one reason or another. There's referrals and other things. And at this point, it's manageable. At some point, we're going to have to prayerfully see how God will provide for that, but at this point, it's manageable. But God's giving lots of opportunities in that sense. I was talking to David the other day about his opportunities up at the school there in Shelton. He's working at the Christian school a couple days a week, right? Or a day per week, but 4 days a week teaching. And Why don't you say some things about that, David? How's it going up there? Can you share with the group kind of what God's doing in terms of opportunities up there? Yeah, it's great. And along with that, Tracy's had opportunities. Obviously, Don has tons of opportunities in the military context. So there's all these little arms and extensions going out from our church in those types of areas. And the common theme in terms of what our purpose is in that is just connecting the dots between people's real messy lives and the gospel. There's a view of holiness that's pretty common in the church that would lead you to believe that the church's purpose is to withdraw from the world and kind of get as far away as possible from the dirty people who might infect us in some way. And that is not at all the view of holiness that God puts forward in his word. In fact, in John's gospel, at one point, Jesus is debating with the religious leaders, and he says, he speaks of himself as the one whom the Father sanctified, made holy, and sent into the world. So that Jesus' holiness actually sent him in the direction of the world and the messy people. There's a sense in which we could say the gospel makes us worldly. And I know that sounds strange because typically we hear worldly as a bad thing. And it can be in terms of the worldly mindset of loving the stuff in this world and worshiping the stuff in this world. But when we have been won over by Christ and we're reveling in this gospel of freedom, then that set apart state, that different state, because that's very different from the rest of this world, the way God moves you is actually toward broken, hurting, sinful people. Not away from them, but toward them with compassion. The same compassion that won you over when you were stuck in your brokenness and desperation. And so that's one of the things that we see as a church here is opportunities, and prayerfully more opportunities to network, whether that's with other churches in the counseling area or through the community. My hope and prayer is that as God works in your lives, and I'll go to my next little multiplication graphic here. I just have this kind of organic life. Again, I was super impressed with myself for coming up with this last year. I thought so. I'm just going to fast forward it. You get the idea. But just like the picture is that God is working. He is not going to be stopped. And he is spreading his message of life through not just me, not just David, but you. Yeah, you and you and you and you, right? All of you. Exactly, Floyd. And we are excited about that and pray that God will continue to work in those ways, and that the things that happen here and the way that we're refreshed here, that it would just spill over. Whether that's the way we view the guy that lives next to us on our street, the guy who works in the cubicle next to us, or whatever. The gospel cannot help but transform your perspective and the way you view people. And then God, along with that, gives opportunities. Let me wrap it up, and then Don, I want you to, if you want to come up, you can, or if you want to just share from there, you can. Let me just wrap it up this way. I said earlier, this is God's church. Therefore, it is your church. God has established and maintained this church for a number of years. I've been here almost 10 years, which is hard to believe. And he's maintained this church and sustained this church through lots of ups and downs and interesting seasons. And for his purposes, he has kept us here and kept me here and kept us as a group here. And a big part of it is that we might grow together in the gospel and serve as God sees fit in our lives. And one other aspect of this I want to speak to before I close here. I'm going to get real personal. About to get in your kitchen, all right? So buckle up, especially you in the front row here, guys. You believe lies. You all believe lies. Lies that make things in this world seem really big, really important, really valuable. And they make the things of Christ and Jesus himself seem really small. I know it's true. And there are layers of those lies, very complex layers. You have patterns of self-sabotage in your life. Don was saying in Sunday school, we're all addicts. You are addicted to certain things. You may not be addicted to substances. You may be addicted to substances, whatever. We're all addicts. And if I talk to your spouse, they would tell me about some of those patterns that drive them bonkers when they watch your life and see you continue to sabotage yourself. Saying you want one outcome, but doing the same destructive thing that keeps getting you to the same destructive end. And we sit there and we watch each other and think, why in the world are you doing that? And then these moments of clarity, we realize, you know what, I'm doing the same thing. And it's all because I'm believing lies. We are not in the business of just telling you what to do here. Hey, here's a moral code, here's an ethical code, go do this. There are reasons you do the destructive things you do. You know better than I do what goes on inside the privacy of your home. Attitudes you have, outbursts you have, words that you say, substances that you take in to try to find relief, entertainment you glut yourself on to try to find relief, whatever it is, busyness that keeps you gets you some measure of relief, whatever it is, there are layers of lies still in your mind. It's just true. God says it's true. It's true. And the gospel tells you that God loves you enough to provide a firm foundation for your feet, this idea that you are loved by God and never will be anything but loved by God. You're secure in Jesus, and throughout your life, He is committed to opening your eyes little by little to just how great He is. As Paul talks about in Ephesians, that He opens your eyes to see what is the breadth and length and height and depth of the love of Christ for you, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up with all the fullness of God. It happens as you see Him. And a big part of that is the peeling back of those layers of lies. And this community is a place, by God's grace alone, where it's safe. As God continues that work and peels back those layers, it's a place where hopefully you can find help, support, loyalty as that process happens. It's happening in all of your lives. God is doing it through the ups, the downs, the good days, the bad days, the fulfilled expectations, the unfulfilled expectations, the failures, the successes, all of it. He's using it all in your life to show you this world's fallen, fleeting, insufficient, non-satisfying. And He is the essence of what you were made for. And so He just relentlessly pursues us, and He gives us a church in which to explore that reality of the gospel together, to grow in it together, and hopefully to see ourselves more clearly. Not to beat one another up or to beat ourselves up, but that we might be set free from those destructive patterns that have controlled us maybe since our earliest days on this earth, that have destroyed not only ourselves and different aspects of our lives and different aspects of our creativity and other things that have been just stifled by that, but also the relationships and the wreckage, as the illustration we use in Sunday school, the wake behind us, just like a boat. The wake that goes behind a boat is just a wake behind all of us of relational damage and all sorts of psychological, physical damage. The gospel is God's message that He cares, has compassion, has mercy. And Jesus came to provide for us forgiveness, a permanent relationship, reconciliation with God, and then to give us an opportunity to walk in the midst of a community in which we grow in our understanding of that gospel. And the more we understand it, when you know the truth does what? Sets you free. So that's philosophically where we're going in the new year. Didn't go into too many details about specifics. But that is what's most important. And you are most important. And the relationships here are most important. And there's lots of fun things that we're looking at doing. And we will continue to do them. But this is the point. This is the vision for the church. And we'll continue to be, Lord willing, while we're here.